Once the government says, we don't like this, we think wrongly that it's costing us money, and therefore anything is fair game. It's open season on smokers, and then presumably on people who like eating so-called junk food, and then people who like gambling, and people who like vaping, and people who like drinking. This is just a charter for totalitarianism almost.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Christopher Snowdon talks about government intervention in public health and the economics behind reducing alcohol consumption, smoking and obesity.
By far the most common justification cited for any kind of nanny state measure is, well, this is going to save the country money. It's going to save the NHS money. It's not true.
Chris talks about bans on public behaviour and how they affect our freedoms and culture.
The aim of policy here is completely eradicating these behaviours, regardless of whether the person engaging in the activity is an informed and rational adult, and regardless of whether there's any knock-on effect to the rest of society.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Christopher Snowdon, Head of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Chris, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you're one of Britain's most vocal opponents in government intervention in alcohol, obesity, smoking.
I'm one of the only, unfortunately. Yeah.
And the government says it's doing these things in the name of public health and saving the NHS. Why is it important that there's also public opposition to them?
Because the type of activities that they're trying to regulate often do have a health aspect, as most things do in life if you search hard enough. But that's not the only aspect, and therefore it's not the only aspect that should be taken into consideration when you're making policy. You know, and I fear that increasingly we are living in a society in which health is the only thing that matters. You know, there's no trade-offs, basically, which I think is why it's important to have, you know, economists speaking out a bit on these issues, because that's, you know, economics is all about trade-offs. And we have a very vehement public health lobby, or a whole group of single-issue activist groups, many of which are state-funded, pushing for infinite regulation, really, on tobacco, on fast food, on alcohol, on gambling now. And the danger is, I think, that we lose track of why people do these things in the first place, which is that they rather enjoy them and they hugely enhance their lives. And so I think that needs to be mentioned a bit more often. It's very hard to quantify compared to, you know, some spreadsheet saying there's X number of lives lost as a result of smoking or alcohol, what have you, and it's more difficult to quantify even than the putative cost to the NHS. We keep getting these usually not very good economic studies saying smoking, alcohol, what have you, cost the NHS X billions or cost wider society tens of billions and so on. Yeah, you know, some of this may be true, some of it may be exaggerated, but we're not factoring in the main thing here, which is consumer well-being and consumer welfare. And if having a drink enhances your life, it's quite difficult to put a value on that, but it's certainly not zero. And you mentioned the prevention aspects of this, which the new government is going very hard on. It seems to me that Keir Starmer, Wes Streeting, Andrew Gwynn, the Public Health Minister, they seem to genuinely believe, in a way that perhaps the Tories didn't always believe, that you can't dig the NHS out of its hole without clamping down on people's lifestyles.
Right.
And for various reasons that we'll probably get into, that's usually not actually correct. But they seem to believe it. And since they don't have any more money really to spend on the NHS, and I think even they probably know that they can only reform it so much, i.e. not very much, I think they're really going to go hard on regulating people's lifestyles. And there is a strong argument against that, both in economic terms and in terms of liberty.
Let's dive into some of the interventions. So next year we're going to see a ban on junk food adverts online, and then before the watershed on TV as well. And this is done in the name of protecting children from obesity. It's been tried to some degree. TfL banned junk food ads. Is it going to work?
I very much doubt it. Firstly, they're not actually the food that's being regulated here, or the adverts for the food, it's not actually junk food as most people would understand it. It's what's known, a bit more of a tongue twister, admittedly, but high in fat, sugar and salt, HFSS. That's actually the type of food. Although even that actually is not, strictly speaking, being regulated, because there's so much HFSS food that most people wouldn't consider for a moment to be junk food, things like raisins and hummus, that they've had to exclude a whole load of food that technically is quite high in sugar or salt or fat in order to not look completely ridiculous. But in any case, adverts for those types of foods have been banned on children's television since 2007, and it's had no impact on child obesity, which has been relatively static, if not slightly rising, during that time. Advertising bans in general don't have very much effect on overall consumption. And so, yeah, I would predict, based on other advertising bans on similar products, alcohol, for example, that it won't have any real effect on the amount of fat, sugar, or salt people consume. It won't have any effect on the amount of calories people consume, but it will lead to a certain blockage in the system in terms of promoting new foods. What will actually happen in practice is that you'll see a whole load more food advertising after 9 o'clock. And you'll see quite a bit more in newspapers, magazines and billboards, at which point the people who've been campaigning for this ban will say, oh, there's a loophole in the law that allows people to advertise at 10 o'clock at night and to advertise on the side of a bus, and we must ban that.
There's also initiatives to tackle adult obesity, one being this NHS going into workplaces and weighing people, and then overweight employees will be referred to a clinic. Yeah. I mean, it's not difficult to see some pitfalls in this one, but can you talk to us a bit about this?
Well, it's just silly, really, more than anything else. I mean, I think this is a voluntary thing that companies can do, so I'm not too concerned from a libertarian perspective about it. I think it's just a bit of a waste of money, and it's bound to be ineffective. I mean, do they really think that people who are obese don't know this? That they need to be weighed at work in order to be told, oh, you should lose a bit of weight. Generally speaking, the vast majority of people who are obese are well aware that they are too heavy and very often would like to lose weight and indeed try to lose weight. It's actually quite hard to keep weight off when you've lost it. So, it's a kind of silly thing that these people come up with. It's not particularly destructive in this instance in the same way that tax rises and advertising bans are. But I think it shows a certain naivety about the people who are designing the policies. They often assume that not them, they're very wise, but everybody else, the general proletariat are very gullible, which is why they think advertising is so powerful, and also really quite ignorant, which is why they need wiser people to show them the way or to be given warnings. For example, the temperance lobby are very keen on having more warnings on alcohol. Well, I think by and large people know that drinking excessively is bad for your liver, is bad for various other things. You shouldn't be doing it when you're pregnant to any great degree. You shouldn't get behind the wheels of a car when you're drinking. People do know this. They might not know exactly what a safe level of drinking is, but nor, to be fair, do the experts, who are always changing their minds about this particular issue. So what really is to be gained by putting a warning label on alcohol? It comes down to this idea that people are only doing these things that the Puritans don't like because they are underinformed, and I don't think they are. I think people, broadly speaking, are well aware that drinking too much is bad for your liver, that eating nothing but cream cakes is going to make you fat, and that smoking is very bad for your health in all sorts of different ways. I don't think there is a lack of information. I don't think the public are systematically underinformed or misinformed, but the public health people kind of assume that we're all a bit thick. And the only way to make someone realise that they're fat is by weighing them at work and telling all their colleagues.
It's almost like we need to stop you from killing yourself because you can't be trusted to consume these things.
Well, fundamentally, that is what it's about, really, yeah. I mean, if you accept that people who, let's take smoking as the obvious example, accept that people understand that smoking is very bad for you, and in actual fact, smokers, if anything, overestimate, actually, how dangerous it is. Like the proportion of smokers that smokers think die of lung cancer is actually a lot higher than it really is. So you could argue that the smokers are slightly over-informed, if anything, right? But the idea that smokers just don't realise that smoking causes lung cancer and heart disease, even though it's emblazoned on every single pack and has been hammered into you since you were about 5 years old, is obviously ridiculous. So in that sense, you are making a conscious choice to do something that you know is very risky, and if you continue doing it for decades, is going to have a really meaningful, create a meaningful risk to your life. So that person has just at that point made the choice, and who is anybody else to say that no, your risk tolerance is wrong? You should be more risk averse than you actually are. I think, like I say, if people are reasonably well informed, then they're adults and they should be allowed to do things which are risky. Now, smoking is an extreme example because it's extremely risky. Drinking more than 14 units a week is not particularly risky. And given that people really quite enjoy drinking, I don't think we should be making it more difficult for people to do.
Is it part of like a growing kind of infantilization of our culture, or this kind of safetyism, or do you think it's more about state control over people?
Well, it's a bit of both. But I think the NHS does play a big part in this. Now, obviously, no other country has anything like the NHS, really. It certainly doesn't have the NHS. And no other country, I think, has quite such a cult around it as the NHS does. And they still, these other countries do also have nanny state movements. So you can't say the whole thing is just about the NHS. But the NHS has been increasingly weaponized to justify this kind of stuff. And you can see why people fall into that belief, because clearly, if you get ill from any cause, but obviously the ones people talk about are things like obesity and alcoholism and smoking, then that is going to cost the NHS money. And so people kind of understandably, I guess, in a very simplistic way, just assume, well, if they weren't doing these things, then we could either cut the NHS budget or we could get more bang for our buck for what we do put into the NHS. And this seems to be the thing that Streeting and Starmer genuinely believe. The problem is it's not really true. In fact, the opposite is pretty much true. I'll take smoking again because it's the clearest example. But there's decades of evidence from economists looking at the lifetime healthcare costs of various different groups of people. And if you compare smokers to non-smokers, it's the non-smokers who use the most healthcare over the course of their lifetime, for the simple reason that they live longer, and people who are old consume a lot more healthcare than people who are young. Both groups of people will die, right? Both people at some point will need end-of-life care. And again, by and large, it tends to be the non-smokers who die from the more expensive diseases, if you will, things like dementia, for example. So the economics of this just don't stack up. Now, the evidence is clearest with smoking. The evidence for obesity, there's not as much of it, but it seems to be telling the same kind of story. And for the same reason, which is that the obese people are not living as long, therefore they're not consuming as much healthcare. And that's before you even get into pensions and the welfare system and the winter fuel payments and the free TV licenses and all the other things that all people consume. Now, this is not to say, and because I know that people watching this who will immediately go, I'm proposing we kill people off to save the government money. I am not saying that. I would never say that. It's a good thing that we have a lot more old people around. But it's worth making that point because by far the most common justification cited for any kind of nanny state measure is, well, this is going to save the country money. It's going to save the NHS money. It's not true. In 1948, when the NHS was founded, its budget was £6 billion in today's money, right? 170 million in 1940s money, but £6 billion in today's money. Today, the NHS budget is nudging £200 billion, right? In 1948, most people smoked. 80% of men smoked. Right? We have not seen any reduction in the NHS budget as a result of smoking declining. Now, of course, there's all sorts of other reasons why the NHS budget has gone up, but I'm trying to make the basic point, which is that people living healthier lifestyles does not actually save anybody any money. In fact, it greatly increases costs. And when the state pension was introduced around the same time after the Second World War, people, life expectancy was 65. The state pension wasn't costing a great deal. Now, life expectancy, I think, is 81 or 82. And it's not been going up very quickly in recent years, but it's projected to carry on rising. And in 10, 15 years' time, there's supposedly going to be a huge number of people, not just in their 80s and 90s, but over the age of 100. These people cost a lot to look after in all sorts of different ways. And rather than grapple with how we're going to pay for that, as all Western countries are having to do, because they're all facing the same kind of old age time bomb, we engage in displacement activity of focusing on people who are young or middle aged who are eating too much sugar or vaping or gambling even. This is just distracting us actually from what is quite a serious economic issue for every wealthy society, particularly those that have socialised healthcare.
So if we got rid of drinking alcohol, obesity, smoking, in the most kind of simple way, the government's going to have less money coming in from
The taxes.
but they're going to save money in the NHS. As a lifestyle economist, are they going to be better off or worse off?
They'll be worse off. I mean, even by the government's own estimates. Okay, so if you tally up all the government's, or at least the estimates that the government uses, they'll often be created by pressure groups, but the government cites them all the time. If you add up the supposed costs to the NHS of smoking, drinking, and obesity, they add up to £12.5 billion, which sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but it's only 4% of the NHS budget, and it's half what smokers and drinkers pay in alcohol and tobacco duty. All right, so it's not just that people living, so-called unhealthy lifestyles and dropping dead at the age of 60 or 65 or 70 save money as opposed to people who are living healthy lifestyles and living to 95. It's also that these demonised groups are paying a huge amount of money in sin taxes, which are effectively subsidising people who don't smoke and don't drink. So the economics of this do not stack up on any level. And as I say, it's not a reason to encourage these bad habits. But you do have to then ask the question, well, if the economic justification doesn't stack up, what's the justification for this stuff at all? And usually there isn't one.
So we've got councils bringing in laws to stop junk food shops, for want of a better term, opening near schools. But then we've got KFC who are mounting legal action. I think over 40 councils they've mounted legal action against to stop that. Do you think we're going to see more of this, where you've got authorities trying to bring in controls and then companies opposing them in the name of profit, really?
Well, you have, and we live in a very legal society now, and there's all sorts of things that governments are constantly trying to do at the local and national level, which they can't do due to the courts. Right. Now, I think that the courts have too much power, but on the other hand, they might be gold-plating these laws, they might be misinterpreting them compared to how the people who created the laws originally envisioned them being used, but politicians can actually change the law at the end of the day. They could, the government can leave the ECHR if it wants to. These are political fights for governments to have. So in a sense, it's part of that problem, that you have politicians trying to do something, but they can't because of the law. But I would say you just need to change the law. The more specific point about fast food shops being near schools, or indeed anywhere, because there was a case last week in Wales, in a tiny town whose name escapes me for the time being, but they have one fish and chip shop, and somebody's talking about opening up another one. And the local public health director strongly opposes this. The local council opposed it on the basis that there are already enough small businesses in this tiny little holiday town.
That one grows. That'd be terrible.
Yeah, we don't exactly. We can't have two fish and chip shops. Imagine that, And they said, well, okay, it might be mostly for the tourists, but local residents are going to be tempted to walk in and have fish and chips. Like, well, obviously we can't have that. Imagine people having fish and chips from one of two outlets. So yeah, you do have a lot of busybodies, and in this instance, I'm quite glad that we have laws that happen to get in their way. But you say opposing it for profit. How do people make profits? By providing services that people want to use. I don't think the main beneficiary of a KFC opening is the people at KFC. I think the main beneficiary is actually the people around it who can now have some fried chicken if that's what they want to have. It sounds quite nice, the idea of, we don't want them opening right next to schools. But if you actually look at how many schools there are in London, where we are right now in central London, you have a look on Google Maps, how many schools there are. They might not be that obvious to you. And then draw a line of 200 metres or 400 metres. Generally, these people want an exclusion zone of 400 metres. I did this once. You would literally have only the middle of the Thames to build a KFC.
Floating island,
yeah,
I guess.
it covers nearly the whole of central London,
right.
This zone. So don't be fooled by thinking this is just about protecting kids from the local chippy opening up next door. Yeah, kids do buy chips at lunchtime. The older ones, the ones that have some money. A lot of them only do it because Jamie Oliver has made their food taste so bad. So I'm on the side of the kids and I'm on the side of the chippy.
The government's considering banning smoking in pub gardens or in outdoor places, or smoking areas as we called them.
Yes, banning smoking in smoking areas.
Yeah, the indoor smoking ban made sense. You're breathing in other people's smoke, fair enough. But how do we understand this outdoor smoking ban?
Yeah, well, that was the argument, you see. It was when they're not using an economic argument, there will be the sort of neighbourhood effect or the negative externality argument of, what about the children? That's quite a common one. But in that instance, it was what about the bar staff, and they shouldn't have to be breathing in second-hand smoke. Well, without going into the evidence about second-hand smoke, which is a dead letter, nobody really is claiming that second-hand smoke is a danger outdoors, right? Because it's not. And nobody proposing this ban, as far as I know, is using that argument. The argument used by Keir Starmer was essentially smoking is bad, it costs the NHS money, and anything we can do to make it difficult for smokers to smoke and to thereby encourage them to quit smoking is fine. And we're going to do it. Now, I'm not sure he will do it. I think hopefully he will see sense and realise that this is going to be absolutely devastating for the pub industry. These are, as you say, basically they are smoking areas. For 2 or 3 months a year when the sun's out, non-smokers go in them a bit. Right? Rest of the year, the only people there are smokers huddling in the cold because they've been kicked out of the pub by legislation in 2007. And the government now wants to take that away spitefully, purely because they don't approve of smoking at all. And if they could ban them from smoking in their own homes, the government apparently would be quite happy to do that, based on the fact that it's bad for your health and it costs the government money. This is a very dangerous precedent to set, to use that argument. It's the same argument, by the way, used for the generational tobacco ban proposed by Rishi Sunak last year, but now taken on apparently by Wes Streeting. Again, nobody was saying this is about the children. They were using the confusing arguments about children, saying this is going to stop 14-year-olds from ever smoking. And I think some people can't quite get through their head that the 14-year-olds in 10 years' time are going to be 24-year-olds. I think that's part of the reason it's relatively popular. Simply people don't actually understand what's being proposed.
And one day 60-year-olds are asking 61-year-olds to buy them some cigarettes.
It's crazy, isn't it? But either way, we're not talking about children. We're very explicitly talking about adults. And a growing number of adults will be progressively banned year by year from ever buying tobacco, any tobacco product, or Rizla, or pipe, or anything that can encase tobacco. The most extraordinary piece of government overreach. But again, it's not based on protecting anybody. It's just we're protecting you from yourself, or we're protecting you 14-year-olds from your future self in case you change your mind when you grow up and decide you want to start smoking. This, as I say, is a very dangerous precedent to set. It's bad enough when these people are using disingenuous economic arguments or arguments about protecting various different groups of people, or saying, we just want to regulate the industry because it is manipulating people's minds with advertising or packaging or what have you. These are all arguments you can have. But once the government says, we don't like this, we think wrongly that it's costing us money, and therefore anything is fair game. It's open season on smokers, and then presumably on people who like eating so-called junk food, and then people who like gambling, and people who like vaping, and people who like drinking. This is just a charter for totalitarianism almost. I mean, there just isn't anything that you can't justify once you take that position, because it logically leads to the conclusion that the aim of policy here is completely eradicating these behaviours, regardless of whether the person engaging in the activity is an informed and rational adult, and regardless of whether there's any knock-on effect to the rest of society.
I mean, those pubs are closing now around 600 per year. But you see the politicians, they love this photo shoot where they're in there pulling pints. The Prime Minister did it recently. What effect are these policies going to have on the hospitality industry? Well,
if there's a total ban on smoking outdoor, outside pubs, wherever that may be, and could even include the pavement, we don't know what these people have in mind, that would be devastating. I mean, the original smoking ban was very, very damaging, led to thousands of pubs closing over several years following its introduction in 2007. But people could, if they smoked, they could just nip outside. And over time, people have got used to nipping outside. And if you're in London, you're probably going to be standing outside anyway, right? I mean, because of the size of the pubs over here and how small they are. Well, how small they are and how many people seem to be prepared to go to them and pay £7.50 for a pint of lager. So smokers could work around it. There are smokers for sure who went a lot less. There's some who stopped going completely because they just didn't like it anymore. But most managed to kind of live with it, get used to it. If you can't smoke anywhere near the pub, then that, as far as I can see, is game over. Smokers are not going to put up with that. They're not going to put up with not being able to smoke at all for a period of 3 or 4 hours when they're drinking. And at that point, they will just say to their non-smoking friends, sorry, but come around mine, you know. It really would be the death knell for so many pubs, and not just pubs, bingo halls, casinos, nightclubs. I mean, which are suffering even more than pubs under the fantastic nightlife czar who's recently departed. I mean, they'd be completely crippled. So it would be an incredibly stupid and damaging thing to do, and a very vindictive thing to do, and that's why I hope and think he probably won't do it. But the other policies, yeah, I mean, a lot of public policy can be explained by just assuming that politicians want to get rid of the pub trade. You know, it sounds conspiratorial, and I'm joking, really. But so much of what politicians do seems designed to shut down pubs. I think a lot of them don't like pubs. I think that pubs sit uneasily with the regimented society that a lot of them quite like. Pubs there's a spontaneity to them. You know, it's not organised, it's not scheduled. It's got an air of, I mean, they're regulated places, but they're not regimented places. They're obviously places of drunkenness as well, right? So I don't think politicians, a lot of them, the more puritanical ones, like how spontaneous and earthy and yeah, drunken, frankly. They're uncontrollable as far as they're concerned. So yeah, I think there's some people who would either like to get rid of pubs or would like to turn them all into this glorified restaurants, really.
So a lot of these things, like going down the pub, having a cigarette, having a kebab, they're kind of primarily interests of the working class people. And do you think to some degree this is an attack on working class culture?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. If you look at the difference now in smoking rates between manual labourers and the kind of lanyard class, it's enormous. It's like 5% of upper professionals smoke, and it's about 20% of manual workers. So it's a huge difference there, and the bigger that difference, the greater that gap grows. It's notable that the more draconian the policies get. In the 1960s, there was no real difference in smoking rates between the rich and the poor across the socio-economic stratum. And there wasn't much in the way of anti-smoking policies. It was left, so long as lots of middle-class people were smoking it was just, well, here's a warning, here's a warning on the advert, now it's up to you. But as it's become much more disproportionately prevalent among working people, who are generally politically disenfranchised to some extent, certainly don't have much of a platform in the media, then the governments felt much more comfortable clamping down on them. The wet pubs, were the ones to suffer with the smoking ban, and I don't think they're much mourned by a lot of people amongst the political elite. Minimum unit pricing in Scotland and Wales, I mean, this is almost explicitly designed to clobber the poor. So if you're rich, you can carry on drinking fine wines and champagne and craft beer, no problem at all. It doesn't have any effect on that. What it has an effect on is cheap cans of cider and lager from the off license. Well, it's gone up now. It was a 50p per unit minimum price. It's gone up to 65p now. So a can of lager with 2 units of alcohol, and it couldn't be sold for less than £1, obviously. Right. So now in Scotland, you can't buy a bottle of vodka for less than £17 something. Whereas in Britain, you can get a bottle of Smirnoff for 15 quid, no problem. So this is almost perfectly calibrated to only hit the working man and woman.
Right.
So yeah, there's a huge element of snobbery to it. And then going back to this HFSS issue, the people who drafted this legislation didn't want to include hummus and raisins and things like this in it, right? There is a vast amount of food that's considered, posh, if certainly respectable, which is very, very high in butter, in sugar. We have Bake Off on TV, British Bake Off all the time. Do people think this stuff is junk food? Well, it's incredibly high in sugar, so in that sense it is. Do people think jam is junk food? Probably not, because it's been around a long time. Everybody eats jam. When people talk about junk food, they're thinking about Pizza Hut and KFC and McDonald's and so on. But the scientific definition, insofar as it is based on science, has to include all this other stuff, which has quite obviously has lots of sugar in it. Butter is a junk food, right? According to this metric, most people don't consider butter to be junk food, so it's been excluded from the list. But a lot of this just comes down to snobbery, because in scientific terms, in nutritional terms, there is really no difference between any of these things. They're all high in at least one of those three supposedly demonic ingredients, all of which, by the way, are the things that make food taste good. You can't have tasty food without sugar, fat, or salt. What are you going to eat? Just eat, have protein shakes the entire time. It's ridiculous. These are the things that are tasty.
There's also an attack on our traditions to some degree. I mean, people have been smoking tobacco for thousands of years. The word cigar comes from the Mayan culture. I mean, we've had pints since the 1600s, and then there's talk of, let's shrink the measures down. I mean, where do these policies come from, and why do they pay no heed to our kind of cultures and traditions?
They're not interested in culture, tradition, or anything else other than health. I mean, that's the bottom line. So if you think that health is the only thing that matters and the only metric to measure, then you don't care about the fact that people have been drinking in pubs for centuries or smoking tobacco for centuries, or millennia in the case of the Americas. Where does this stuff come from? Well, it's an interesting question. In fact, when I first got interested in this issue 20 years ago, that was kind of my question. I wrote my first book about the history of the anti-smoking movement, actually, because I'd noticed there were these anti-smoking activists agitating for various things, and I wondered who they were and why they would do it. It seemed to me an odd thing to do. If you don't smoke, fine. If you don't like smoking, fine. But why would you dedicate your life to stopping other people doing it? And I expected, when I dug into it, to find a bunch of kind of eccentric characters or maybe religious nuts and so on. And there were lots of those initially in the first few centuries of anti-smoking. And anti-smoking goes back nearly as long as smoking in Europe, right? The first people to smoke, first Europeans to smoke were put in prison by the Inquisition when they got back to Spain, right? So hatred of tobacco is not a new thing. But yeah, by and large, for hundreds of years, it was dictatorial tyrants who just didn't like the smell of it, like James I, or it was religious people who believed it to be a vice, or it was just weird single-issue cranks who never really got much of a movement behind them, but were quite interesting and in a way quite endearing people, really. These days, and since about the 70s, there's no grassroots agitation against this stuff. There's the Salvation Army aren't too keen on gambling and alcohol, but that's about it. You really can't find any grassroots activism, and yet these people, haven't been so politically successful for decades, if ever. So where would they come from? The answer is actually the government just gives them money. I mean, that's usually what it is. You've got a lot of activist academics who are generally speaking funded by some grant from the state in some form or other. They tend to be very vocal and essentially act as campaigners. And then you have these tiny little pressure groups who are punched well above their weight. And I mean groups that might have 3 or 4 people on the staff, right? But you read about them all the time because they're very good at using the media. Action on Sugar, Action on Smoking and Health. There's various alcohol groups up in Scotland, Alcohol Focus Scotland, and others. Most of them, Action on Sugar isn't actually, but the rest of them are all funded by the state to a greater or lesser extent, usually to a greater extent, and very often 100%. So, that's where it comes from. It essentially comes from another wing of government. It's a very weird situation because you end up with a government-funded entity lobbying the government to do something the government may or may not want to do. And the government doesn't always necessarily want to do it. So you think, well, why are they funding them? It's a very weird situation. I think the reason they're funding them is not actually there's no ministers making a decision on this stuff. The Department of Health budget is like £200 billion or something. The minister is not going to be signing off a cheque for £200,000 to some pressure group. So it's a deal that goes on between the bureaucrats at the Department of Health and these other pressure groups. You do get some private funding, to be fair, but it tends to be from big billionaires like Michael Bloomberg or Bill Gates, people like that. But there is very, very little in terms of grassroots activity, and very little in the way of grassroots donations. So in other words, the public don't seem to care that much. I mean, they don't care enough to get up and do anything about it. And while some opinion polls will say, yes, the public support this nanny state measure or not so keen on this nanny state measure, I think the support for this stuff, it might be wide, but it's very, very shallow. And if you said, for example, to people, do you support banning smoking in beer gardens if it means the chance of your local going bust in the next 12 months rises from 10% to 50%, I suspect that the support would go down significantly. You know, again, there's trade-offs here. People are not thinking about the trade-offs. They're not thinking about the costs of these policies. Similarly, you know, the food advertising ban or any advertising ban. People are very keen on advertising bans. People don't really like advertising. It gets in the way of the programs, and they find it annoying. The trouble is they don't really connect it with the fact that they're getting the programs for free, right? And they're getting the metro for free or whatever it may be. So any advertising ban that's ever proposed, there's always strong public support, about 70% for it. I suspect if you put out a poll question of would you support a ban on all advertising, most people would probably say yes, right? But that's not really that's not the question that policymakers at least have to answer. All right, policymakers need to live in a bit more of a three-dimensional world, and the question that really should be asked is, do we support a ban on, for example, gambling advertising and sponsorship, if it means that football clubs have a reduction in their revenue of whatever it may be? I mean, a very large amount, right. And not just Premiership clubs, but clubs are all going all the way down the ladder to the 9th division. Clubs that have very little money. Do we support it there? Well, some people still will, because they just hate gambling and they don't want to be reminded about it, and they think that advertising causes problem gambling, for which there's no evidence. But I think a lot of people go, actually, I think I can probably live with, you know, Bet365 being on the team's shirt if it means that, you know, the club gets another striker, you know.
Yeah. I think back to lockdown, we had you know, our freedoms being taken away in the name of public health and saving the NHS, and kind of Chris Whitty's like looming over it. It feels to some degree there's this like deja vu of that. I mean, why do we keep going back to this?
Well, Chris Whitty's been very influential, I think, in the last couple of years. I gather he was the one who persuaded Rishi Sunak to go with this very unconservative policy of gradually prohibiting tobacco. Chris Whitty is still quite popular with the public, rightly or wrongly, because of the COVID experience. And during COVID, the Department of Health got much more engaged with the Prime Minister, with Number 10. They were constantly meeting. And you would not believe how many hundreds of people at the Department of Health are working specifically on these lifestyle issues. Right. You know, they have a whole teams of people working on tobacco, vaping, obesity, alcohol.
So they're like a health blob. You know, we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, it's a huge health blob. You know, and there's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of people working in each of these areas. And I mean, what are they doing all day? Who knows? But what they want to do is change policy, obviously. It's the main thing they want. They want more money for their area of interest, which they generally get, and they want to see some changes. So you have people who are essentially activists working within the Department of Health. This probably happens across the board, I don't know, but it certainly happens in the Department of Health. It attracts activists. All these organisations are going to attract activists. The World Health Organization attracts activists, which is why the World Health Organization is now just off the scale crazy when it comes to this lifestyle stuff, which rightly is none of their business. You know, they really should be focusing on infectious diseases. And I think one of the reasons they dropped the ball on COVID is they weren't focusing on infectious diseases. They were focusing on reformulation of biscuits and, you know, scaring people about the dangers of vaping. But yeah, I mean, COVID always looked like it could be a turning point, and it could have gone one of two ways. I always thought. I thought either once all this is over, once the lockdowns are finished, people will say, right, we sacrificed a lot there. Not quite sure whether it was worth it, but we did sacrifice a lot for the sake of mainly old people's health. And now we're going to make up for it by really enjoying ourselves. And we're going to have the 20s is going to be roaring. We're going to start deregulating all these things and just say, no, you want to have a drink, you go have a drink, you deserve it. Or I thought it would mean that, and this is obviously what happened, that public health just became even more of a sort of sacred cow, that governments would keep referring back to COVID and saying, look, we did all this, we sacrificed ourselves, sacrificed our liberty during the pandemic, we can sacrifice a bit of liberty to become a smoke-free nation or to reduce the number of alcohol-related deaths or whatever it may be. Now that, as I say, is obviously, unfortunately, what happened. It was always the more likely of the two scenarios, in my opinion. But yes, it set a very nasty precedent because it showed that in that particular instance, there really is no limit to, you know, how much the government can control your life in the name of public health. And one of the messages I tried to put out at the time, as somebody who was not some, you know, anti-lockdown, you know, anarchist by any means, I did try and remind people that, you know, whatever you think of these draconian policies, and some of them clearly are ludicrous, you know, Scotch egg issue in the pub. I don't know if you remember that, but well, the pubs really got hit hard by the government during COVID. It kind of goes to my point again that all government policy is indirectly aimed at closing down pubs. So when we came out of lockdown, we suddenly had all these ridiculous rules. You got to walk around it, and you have to put a mask on if you go to the bar, but then you can take it off to eat your food, and then you have to put it on to go to the toilet and all this kind of rubbish. But when they brought in the tier system, it got to the point where, certainly where I live and when the vast majority of people live, we were in tier 2, I guess. You could go to the pub. In tier 1, the pubs were closed completely, as I recall. You could go to the pub, but only on your own and only to eat.
Continuous Scotch eggs.
Well, that's what people were doing, yeah. People were basically just ordering big bowls of peas and just going through them slowly, because once you finished your meal, you had to finish your drink and leave. This, again, is these people want pubs to be glorified restaurants. And that's what they became for a while, but with ludicrous argument about what constitutes a meal. This is where the Scotch eggs comes in, because Michael Gove, I think, was asked, is a Scotch egg a meal? And he said, yes, they are. And then that led to a national debate for several days about whether a Scotch egg really is a meal or not. And then people, of course, just went to the pub and ordered a Scotch egg. And 8 pints of lager.
We'll always find a way to get around these things as the British public.
We will. We will and we do, which is why these policies are so ineffective. You know, and we haven't really talked about how ineffective they are, because I've been mainly talking about how unnecessary they are and how immoral they are, but they are remarkably ineffective. I say remarkably, it's maybe not so remarkable when you consider that we live still in a relatively affluent country. The more laws we have, the more people seem to disrespect them, I think probably rightly. And the kind of nudges that public health people use, whether it's advertising bans or tax rises or minimum pricing, they're annoying, but you can get around them. You know, and what happens actually, where if you put the sugar tax is a good example of this, but also alcohol taxation. It's annoying. The price of the beer goes up a little bit, but a can of Coke went up by 8p. But okay, I guess a can of Coke now costs 8p more. You know, it's not going to fundamentally change people's shopping habits, and it doesn't. You know, if you like drinking Coca-Cola, as I do, you're not going to switch to Diet Coke just because it's marginally cheaper. And so people just put up with it, which is one of the reasons there's not a big pushback against this, because people just go, yeah, it's irritating, but it's hardly worth my while forming a campaign group about this and going down Trafalgar Square every couple of weeks. So you kind of have to like it or lump it. Now, there are some things like tobacco prohibition, which, you know, or also indeed banning smoking outside pubs, which are just so far over the line that people just won't put up with it, you know, and you will have an even bigger black market in tobacco. And I'm quite sure you will have people just disregarding the rules outside pubs, because the landlord won't want to enforce them, because he doesn't want to drive more of his customers away, and the other customers won't care. Why would anyone actually care? Even if you hate smoking, why would you care about somebody outside in the middle of January having a cigarette in your pub? You don't, unless you're an incredibly misanthropic person, and there are quite a few of them in Britain, but they're not by any means the majority. So yeah, these things don't work because we have a population that's pretty stubborn, and there is still an element of individualism, I think, about the British public, an element of anti-authoritarianism. We don't like governments of any stripes. You can see how quickly Keir Starmer's fallen out of favour within 3 months. You know, and I actually think we're becoming a little bit more continental in our approach to government. You know, we used to be a country that didn't have many laws, but we enforced them. Places like Italy tend to be countries where they have lots of laws and they're not enforced. We now have got the worst of both worlds, where we've got lots of laws and we have lots of busybodies trying to enforce them. But I think increasingly we have a public that is resistant to it. You know, if you have a few good laws, then people tend to respect them. If you have lots of bad laws, people don't.
What do you think the long-term consequences will be if we keep allowing these freedoms to be chipped away in the name of our own good?
Well, we'll live in an extremely oppressive society, and I think quite an unhappy society. I haven't seen any sign of any of these supposed public health advances over the years in terms of lifestyle making us a happier country. It might in some way be a healthier country, but it seems to me that, look at the number of people on antidepressants, you wonder whether maybe a few people would be better off smoking or at least vaping. Nobody wants to say that. Even I hesitate to say it. But if you're interested in public well-being, public welfare, which I am, rather than just public health, which is just one small component of public well-being, then this stuff is, on balance, negative, and perhaps very negative. And if we carry on in this direction, but let's define our terms. If we carry on in the direction of smoking, which is now being literally prohibited, albeit in a very slow and weird way, but I'm sure they will speed that up later on. Don't worry about that. But it is being prohibited, and that is now apparently, there's cross-party support for it, and apparently it's quite popular. So when we say going down the same road, what we mean is eventually prohibiting junk food, that's so-called, alcohol, vaping, and gambling. That's the direction of travel. Will we be a healthier society if we do that? Well, up to a point, yeah. Probably. Will we be a happier society, a more fulfilled society? Will we be leading more enjoyable lives? Will we be living in a country that people want to live in? No, not really. I don't think so at all. No, that's not going to happen. Okay, hopefully. I assume it's not going to happen. But we're certainly going to move in that direction. And I think the more we move in that direction, by and large, the more miserable people are going to be. So, that is my argument against it. But the thing is, nobody ever talks about it in those terms. What they talk about is each individual incremental step, all of which seem quite trivial, or most of which seem pretty trivial along the line. Oh, we're just going to bump up taxes a little bit. We're just going to ban advertising, but only on, you still be able to advertise on TV after 9 o'clock. You still be able to advertise on, in the newspapers. Or we're going to restrict sponsorship of this. But it's all just nibbles away at it. As we've seen with smoking, it was a very clever way they went after smoking. Nobody ever said we want to get rid of smoking completely. On the contrary, they said obviously we don't want to get rid of smoking. We're not prohibitionists. We just want to stop children from starting to smoke. And for that reason, we need to ban the advertising. Then we need to ban the cigarettes being displayed in shops, and then we need to ban menthol cigarettes and packs of 10, and have slightly bigger warnings, and then graphic warnings, and then nothing but warnings on the back. It all happens incrementally in such a small way that most people just think, well, fine, makes no real difference to me. It doesn't affect me anyway because I don't smoke. But this stuff adds up quite quickly. And increasingly quickly, because the pace is really moving now. Because we have this anti-smoking blueprint, the other people who are going after food and going after gambling, going after alcohol, they can just copy the blueprint and they can speed things along quite quickly. It took decades to get a tobacco advertising ban in place. All it took was Boris Johnson getting COVID for us to have a ban on HFSS food advertising, which admittedly is not complete yet, but it will be. And once the first step is taken, it's a very big step, banning all online advertising. That's obviously the main area of advertising these days. Mopping up print media and what's displayed on bus stops would be a simple exercise. And they'll do it, regardless of whether it works or not. Because it's kind of win-win from their point of view. If the policy doesn't work, then you've got to do something else because the policy hasn't worked. If the policy does work, you say, well, we must build on its success. And so you just have this runaway train of regulation, and nobody ever says, this thing didn't really work, why don't we repeal it? The idea of repealing any of this stuff is never even mentioned. Never even mentioned in the media. We do interviews, as I do on, let's say, 5 Live, about, let's take the example of the outdoor smoking ban. The question from Nicky Campbell is never, is this a good idea, or in fact should we repeal the original smoking ban and have smoking rooms in pubs? That's never the question. The question is this a good idea, or does the government need to go further? Right? So the whole public debate is slanted in the direction of it's just taken as read that we must keep banning things. That's why people use the phrase, is it time to ban such and such, so often. And that's an interesting use of words, I think. Is it time to? Because the implication is that there will be a time to do this. The question is it now? Right? So it's sort of like a reverse version of the Whig version of history. The Whig history suggests that basically everything is just progress. History is moving inexorably in an enlightened way towards progress. And this is kind of the reverse of that, in which we live in this horrendously unregulated society of unhealthy people being allowed to do things and becoming unhealthy as a result. And the natural progress of society is just to gradually ban things until you can't do any of this stuff whatsoever.
Why? Why do we keep moving towards this prohibition?
I don't know. I mean, well, at the basic political level, for the reasons I've explained before, because the groups that are in favour of all this nanny state stuff have got money, and the people who are against it, A, don't have enough reason to mobilise because all this stuff affects them in a relatively small way, and B, they haven't got any money. You know, if there was the equivalent of Michael Bloomberg who was dishing money out to libertarians to form libertarian groups on this kind of stuff, perhaps it would happen. The only money they can realistically get is from industry, and at that point you're immediately painted as being a puppet of industry, right? So you would say that because you get money from industry. We get this at the IEA all the time because some of our donors are from businesses. So at the political level, we're outgunned by professional pressure groups who spend all their time lobbying for greater restrictions on people's freedom. But the question of why the public go along with it, even in the kind of in the abstract or in the sense of ringing up Nicky Campbell and saying I support this thing, I don't know. I think bans beget bans to some extent. Once people get used to having their lives regimented and regulated, it just sets a precedent, doesn't it? And very often I find that even people who kind of agree with me on certain issues will say, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this, we should be going after them instead. You know, it's like, yes, we pay enough in tax and alcohol, we should be cutting the tax and alcohol. What we should be doing is taxing hamburgers. And it's like, no, this is a circular firing squad. Then if you believe in individual choice, you need to be consistent on this stuff. You can't just pick at things that you don't personally like. We all have certain things that we dislike, but if everyone gets their vote on the things that they dislike to be banned, everything ends up getting banned very quickly. What we really need to do is just take a balanced overall and liberal view of these issues and ask ourselves, because I'm not against all regulation, what are we trying to achieve with this regulation? What is a problem that needs solving? And the problem that needs solving can't simply be this thing is bad for your health, because you're allowed to take risks with your health in a free society. There could be legitimate reasons for regulation. It could be, despite what I said earlier, it may be people that really don't understand that eating cream cakes is more fattening than eating celery, in which case let's have a public information campaign. Fine. I don't believe that's the case, but if there is what economists call information asymmetries, there's nothing wrong with the government trying to fix them. If there are genuine costs to the government from certain activities, it's fine to put a tax on that product. We do this with alcohol. Alcohol actually, I didn't mention alcohol before for this very reason. Alcohol, as far as I can tell, actually does have a net cost to society. Mainly because there are lots of kind of issues around social disorder, crime, drink driving, lots of negative externalities that you just don't get with people smoking or eating too much. Now, the tax that we have on alcohol far exceeds any realistic estimate of what that cost is, but there is a cost there. So it's absolutely fine to tax that product and try and recoup that money. So, drinkers are washing their face, as it were. So there are reasons to regulate things. It's just that we've kind of run out of them now. We tax these products to excess, as it is. And we have, I think, enough education and warnings to ensure that we have a pretty well-informed population. And so long as we're stopping children getting hold of products that are not designed for them, then adults should be left alone. And that's one of the things that we face with vaping. There's a lot of hysteria about underage vaping at the moment, and I think probably exaggerated, but there's no doubt that kids are getting hold of vapes. Some of them at quite a young age. I mean, I'm talking 9, 10, 11. Which not acceptable at all. But it's been illegal to sell vapes to kids for nearly 10 years now. And a lot of the vapes that are being sold to kids in corner shops are not even regulated legal products. These are illegal vapes coming in from China being sold illegally to children, right? Why can't we do something about that? Why are we talking about, we'll clamp down on flavours, we'll clamp down on advertising? It's not going to make any difference, really. You're just going after adults. Why can't we enforce it? And are we going to even enforce those laws? We're not enforcing the basic law of underage sales. We time and time again in this country, across all sorts of policy areas, we use legislation as a substitute for governing. Governing is harder to do. It requires money, you require people to do it, you need laws to be enforced. We're not enforcing a lot of these laws, particularly on vaping. And as a result, rather than give trading standards some more money and tell them to start going into shops and get some kids to go in as decoys and see if it's very easy. We do it with tobacco, we do it with vodka. It's really hard now for kids to buy cigarettes or alcohol from a legitimate shop, but not hard apparently to get e-cigarettes. Why not? We can clamp down on underage vape sales just as easily as we did on tobacco and alcohol sales. There just isn't the will to do it. Instead, there's a will to legislate and legislate and legislate, and you can have a public debate, and some public health minister can get his name on the front page of the paper for a few weeks saying, I'm taking tough action on this, and then nothing changes, except for the worse.
Christopher Snowdon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.